So, welcome back. It was a really nice moment. I don't know what you think about this moment in the exhibition space, but I think it was a really good way to come back here and to start another conversation. So within BAM, we share a lot of things in between this team. I mean, this is the idea to start with the artwork, as you know, but we also share the Foucauldian approach of history through genealogy. And the term genealogy has been said quite a few times during the past days, and now we are really coming into it. So if yesterday we discussed and analyzed a generation of artists belonging to, well, that started their work in the 60s, 70s and blew up in the 80s. Now we are going to speak of a younger artist called Mathieu Kleyebe Abonnenc, and it will be followed by a performance by Patricia Arndt. And it was very important for us to think this genealogy of practice, of artistic practice. So there were also some things that we said yesterday about the fact an artwork could be viral or even dangerous in an exhibition space. We were speaking about the work of Medalla situated outside the space, and I think it was Nick saying, what would have been different to put this work into the exhibition space? And in terms of the Mathieu Abonnenc's artwork, we will see how his work is about being quite dangerous in itself in the exhibition space, as an assumed position. And also, last point, I think it's very interesting to have been to Rational Wings exhibition just before coming here and speaking about Mathieu's work. There's so many connections in terms of the minimal art and the social space. This juxtaposition of type of images together is exactly what we are going to speak about this afternoon. So, without further notice, I'm going to introduce the three speakers of the afternoon. Sandra Delacourt is our first speaker. She's holds a PhD in contemporary art history, and she is an associate researcher at ICSA at University of Paris 1. After teaching at Paris 1 and University of Nantes, she now has a master program in art of the ESBA Time Tour, especially concerned with the emergence phenomena operating in the field of art history. Her works deal with the processes of artistic recognitions, the policies of the visible, and the construction of historical narratives. Focused on the academic turn, her doctoral research shed light on the unprecedented intellectual authority accorded to the American minimalists, while cognitive capitalism and creative research impose themselves as a new epistemological horizon. In 2016, she co-authors Le Chercheur et ses Doubles at B42 edition. Through Mathieu Abonnenc, Kapwani Kiwanga, and Otobong Nanga's work, this book questions the role and uses of art in the production of knowledge. Entitled L'artiste universitaire, un rêve américain au prisme de Donald Judd, a new book will be published in 2018. Sandra is based in Paris, where she also works as an independent art critic. Should I present all? No? Okay. Sandra.
So thank you very much, Sophie, and thank you to all of us. I'm really pleased to be part of this so exciting conference. And I'm also pleased today to speak about, or speak from Mathieu Kleyebe Abonnenc's artwork. So I will focus principally on two artworks. And I think, shall I going to show you straight? Yeah. An Italian film, Africa Addio, that we watched yesterday evening, and untitled Bodies in a Pile, which is an installation. Sorry. So I will lay emphasis on the specific dialectic established by Mathieu Abonnenc between paralysis and movement, between fertility and sterility, I will use these two artworks to discuss the way he implements alternative politics to bring to the fore those who inhabit the present without to be seen or without to being authorized to move within it. So since the early 2000s, Mathieu Abonnenc had made the politic of the visible both the subject matter and the matrix of his work, viewing access to visibility and to present as a discriminatory process. He set up devices so that history that does not acknowledge as a subject, that history has not acknowledged as a subject, is permitted to claim right to representation, mobility, and agency. An Italian film, and Bodies in a Pile, records a simple process, a very simple process of casting and transforming copper crosses from Katanga into sculptural objects formerly closed for minimal arts. Through this gesture of physical convention, Mathieu Abonnenc reinjects into our collective imagination what was wandered, invisible, powerless, and motionless throughout and by history. Lives that were objectified, reduced to insignificance, or a state of containment, are re-involved in a process with potential for change, growth, and change. As I will try to show, Mathieu brings a multiplicity of inanimate ancestors back in flow. By doing so, he addresses past and present conditions for object and subject to flow, as well as ranking, classification, and sectorization of the living. In this respect, I will finally draw attention to his use of minimal art as a way to generate crossroads between dominant and minority narratives. So, an obvious issue raised by Mathieu Abonnenc's work could be framed as follows. How render visible bodies that have been prevented, or have prevented themselves from appearing? How can their body, their history, how can their history be told without asserting the status as powerless object or dominated subject? Is that clear? Sorry, this sentence was awful, and I can repeat if necessary. It's okay? Sorry. So in these two works, Mathieu Abonnenc starts out at the opposite end of the spectrum, from other endeavors to represent, assign, and determine identity. In doing so, he refutes the rank and the place history and the collective imagination attribute to one and all. As Judith Butler pointed out, not everyone is able to assume a corporeal form. Anyone dispossessed of their body is necessarily excluded from representation and from representativeness. Butler's thinking is of great value in understanding what we witness in this movie. This film is first and foremost the history of a body in itself intersectional, one to which generations of declassified individuals have lent their features. This is a body which needs other bodies to assert the right to cooperative. Though disconnected at first sight, British workers, Katanga copper eaters, American minimalists, and today's eBayer, because I forgot to tell you, the clothes from Katanga were bought by Mathieu on eBay. So just So, British workers, Katanga's copper eaters, American minimalists, and today's eBayers turn out to be materially intertwined. This film allows absent bodies to intrude our familiar visual and narrative regime. They intrude a normative economy of the visible. They disrupt the meaning of visibility, complicate what seemed legible, and makes transparency a fraud. Duplicating image and meaning this way renegotiates the supposed relations between dominant and dominated, precisely because looking at one necessarily implies to look at the other. Shunning the codes of documentary film, Mathieu Abonnenc records the ordinary activities of a British vestige of industrial capitalism and the corporeal mechanics that implacably place physical constraints on materials. British labourers are at work. In their hand are Katanga copper crosses. Their gestures are precise, calm, perfectly controlled, and yet violent. Mathieu Abonnenc's film A Transgenerational Danse Macabre. This Danse Macabre is taking place in the antechamber of the visible. As witnesses to pre-colonial and pre-industrial history, the Katanga crosses are the object counterparters of those who produces them. First, the corporation of copper eaters, soon replaced by slaves, then forced laborers, and those who were colonized. Their body and those of their recent successors have been largely swallowed up by the mine, which turned Katanga into industrial capitalism, voracious stomach. So Mathieu's camera is set somewhere between the bowels of the earth and the heights, culminating in copper values market values. It focuses on the logistic of exploitation, which even today cause bodies to bend and yield. It lingers over the foundry workers' movement and the relationship with those bodies that are absent. Many of these underground ancestors return to Earth unnamed and without a burial ground. From generation to generation, they create the fertile ground of Katanga's malachite. Their body fills the holes that they were themselves digging. It is not insignificant that Mathieu Abonnenc should have chosen to tell their stories through the eminently metaphorical process of copper transformation. The workers who perform the casting have to sort the wheat from the chaff. They grind salt and sieve the raw until a powder obtained onto which water is poured. The seed remains at the bottom, only the finest part of the ore floats at the top. So an Italian film shows such process, the division between matter that is allowed to rise to the surface of the visible and the rest that is sent down into the depths of Earth. But Mathieu Abonnenc doesn't simply record this process. The strategy he uses makes real spaces for agency and action of the collective body. Anonymous bodies set other bodies in motion. Some are melted down, others are protected, yet it is not apparent which sets one in motion. Bodies that have wrapped and twist one another are also seen as vulnerable. It is the space of such reversibility that Mathieu Abonnenc invests and makes manifest. It may seem paradoxical that he would choose to introduce subjects into the domain of the visible by industrially transforming them into sculptural objects. Yet, recasting them as an opportunity is also an opportunity to provide them with lasting protection. Protected by their status as art objects, the copper ingots takes their place in a museal institution since those two works were acquired in 2013 by the Macval, which is a museum in the suburb of Paris. So through Mathieu Abonnenc's gesture, the institution is invited to preserve the body of the copper eaters, of the colonized people of Katanga, and the British worker of Sheffield. The fact of the work becoming a part of French heritage is of course a belated recognition of the bonds of proximity, even kinship, with those forgotten bodies. But in some ways, they are also, as they are part of the museum rituals, they exert influence over its practice, its actor, and also the collection itself. So maybe we can talk together after about the potential toxicity and corrosiveness. Inscribing gazettes, the sculpture is a direct line of minimalism, an American art theoretics canon, is also a way for Mathieu Abonnenc to refuse to contribute to an asymmetric distribution of strength and weakness. Indeed, he makes no difference in his formal treatment and processual treatment of the history of dominator and dominated. And as he blends Katanga's colonial history with that of the United States, He redefined the axis of the world trade, which from the 16th century on achieved the lasting alliance of capitalism and colonialism. Not a simplistic criticism, his gesture unites in some body the two theoretical opposed faces of the cultural domination. In 1966, Europe mourned the end of the order in its former colonies. In Africa Dio, the original Italian movie by Jacopetti e Prospetti, which gave its name to Mathieu's Abonnenc film, celebrates the highly rational intellectual. Oh, sorry. In this film, Africa is shown as being given over to wild anarchic hordes. Bodies shown in the film are fragmented, disjointed, hysterical, and out of control. The same year, 1966, was held in New York Primary Structures. The show presented the first generation of US artists, later called minimalist artists, celebrated for their highly rational intellectual rigor. They used industrial manufacturing process and materials, including copper. Their work featured, in particular, a perfectly controlled and ordered serial unit. As soon as 1966, they were acclaimed as the heir of the most prestigious Western art. This reference to minimal art is much more relevant than we could think at first glance. Indeed, minimalism marked a profound change of paradigm in North American cultural history. Until this time, US art history has been written on a template of self-taught painters who set themselves apart from European aristocratic intellectualism. Despite the United States international leadership, after World War II, North American art is still considered as Europe's poor relation. Post-war heroes, such as Pollock, were covered by attribution to primitivism. This situation appeared as a narrative compromise that meant that Europeans, whether they liked it or not, could acknowledge a wide offspring that was about to safeguard the glorious legacy. With primary structures, American art was linked to the valorization of order, clarity, impersonality, and objectivity. Its reception had been pulled over the side of control, both by its supporters and its detractors. Associated with male domination, since, for example, UC Lippard showing in 1966 eccentric abstraction, or minimal art was also denounced as a henchman of an authoritarian history, and then in 1968 as the expression of the established power and the strong arm of capitalism, especially by Mello, Meyer, Beveridge, Levin, Foster, Chave, and so on. So, however, many artists linked to minimalism view it as a means of emancipating themselves from the warrior of Eurocentric, transcendent, essentialist, and determinist thinking. Calling into question the universal nature of historical narrative transposed onto North American art, they denounced a situation of acculturation. Donald Judd, for example, strove to deconstruct Europe as a production center of a hegemonic rationality. Though he emphasizes the importance of situated, territorialized thinking, his critical stance failed to undermine that ambient universalism. If American minimalists gained access to an international recognition, they had little leverage over the regime and the politics of the visible, since they were either prized or disparaged by the same egocentric discourses whose partiality and brutality they themselves denounced. This fact highlights the strong controls exercised over what, even visible, may or may not be authorized to fertilize the social body and the collective imagination. Sifting the wheat from the chaff, the politics of the visible simply erase those whose work cannot easily fit with this rhetoric of rational order. For example, we can easily think about the way British artists or Arndt or or Judy Chicago, where part of funerary structure was ousted later from the memory of this show, for different reasons we can talk about after if you want. So since the 60s, minimalism was disinfected and voided of all political and epistemological critique. Its neutralization, immobilization, and sterilization seems to have been the condition on which it was authorized to enter art history. Art history with the capital H, of course. So, as the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quirano has pointed out, decolonization has in no wise marked the end of coloniality as a matrix of power. And I quote it, coloniality will remain unbeat until the duality between body and non-body is ended. End of quote. In this respect, the virulent debate on the anthropomorphic dimension of minimal art was significant. Starting with primary structures, the reception of minimalism turned on an issue that was particularly thorny for critics: the problematic presence of inanimate objects that viewers were forced to face as equals. Also, minimalists reject any notion of representation and any hidden illusionistic or metaphorical content. Overall, their work was denied materiality and corporeity. In 1967, it was generically denounced by Michael Fried as empty prisons that have to be filled with meaning by a gaze or a narrative. In 1972, Harold Rosenberg still views them as spaces onto which discourse has to be projected, and from France, Georges Didier Huberman spoke of interiority in search of a subject, for example, and Thierry de Duve of specular devices. So, the great hostility shown toward the inanimate claiming to be a present is of course very reminiscent of the discourse that deprived colonized people of their corporeity and their quality of subjects. It is worthwhile noting, as Gilles Monsteron did, that colonial discourse borrowed the vocabulary of its civilizing mission from what was previously used for rural areas, for those who worked in the land, and later for lab factory workers. The logic pertaining to such discourse is the same as the historical phenomena that appropriated the female body for purposes of social reproduction. In this light, it is not insignificant that the fight to claim presentness, and moreover an active presentness for inanimate objects, was so vehement. Of course, in the main, the discursive arsenal of domination, on the dissociation of the body and the spirit, on the hierarchization of life, and the legitimacy of what may or may not be seen, resisted any attack mounted by minimalism. So, in conclusion, I would like to underline that Mathieu Abonnenc's work helps to clarify forms of visual paralysis and the epistemic framework used to hold this in place. Apprehending it is involve acknowledgement of the struggle mounted against the modern episteme, as well as the gradual, icy logic it used to systematically quash them. I could re-explain later if you want, if it's not that clear. So what I just wanted to say is that the resistance, there is a variation of degree in the resistance to the attack of against the episteme, the modern episteme. So variations in the degree of violence exerted for such repression are extremely significant. Calibrated on the degree of dehumanization applied in each case, its own hierarchization of life is exactly reflected. So the struggle of minimalists was deemed reasonably rational and was simply ignored. The struggle of colonized people were however bestialized and therefore made punishable by death. Denying minimal art its dimension as a struggle only render the mechanics of this implacable regressive logic less perceptible. and also its intersectional nature. So through these two works, Mathieu drew our attention to our own position in the human hierarchy. It formalized the interconnecting position of ascendancy and vassaldom and the fear of personal declassification, which buttresses such position in a perpetual return to order. Thank you, and so sorry for your ears, and I have this awful French accent.
Thank you very much, Sandra. So now we are listening as Jennifer Burris. Jennifer is a curator and writer based in Bogota. She has organized exhibitions at the Brooklyn Museums, Overford College Cantor Fitzgerald Gallery, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, and the Kitchens in New York. In 2015, she co-founded Marfa Sounding, an ongoing series of performances, sound installations, and screenings in the town of Marfa. As a writer, she has contributed to publications including the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, Studies in French Cinema, BOM, Revista Código, After All, Online and Freeze, and as well as artist monographs for Brian Mills in Semitex, Gottfried Doncourt for Arto, Alexandra Navratil for Roma Publication, and Rafael Montañez Ortiz. So she also was a curatorial fellow at the Whitney Independent Study Program in 2011 and 2013 at Whitney, Lauder curatorial fellow at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia. So, Jennifer, thank you for coming.
Thank you to the conference organizers and also to everyone who's spoken over the last 2 days. I've really learned so much, and I'm so delighted to be here. The beginning is a moment of great delicacy. I am speaking to you of a past shorn of meaning, of a story that has lost its shadow and can no longer claim a meaning. What follows here is a collection of fragments, of snatches of silence. So opens the script for Mathieu Abonnenc's 2011 work, Forward to Guns for Banta. Overlain on a black and white slideshow of graphic images and archival photographs, this three-part conversation between interviewer, militant, and director is drawn from multiple archives concerning the making and subsequent disappearance of a 1970 propaganda film shot during Guinea-Bissau's fight for independence. Abonnenc's script is based on a series of interviews that he conducted over the course of 3 years with the director of this film, Sarah Malderer. Collating these stories with testimonies, narratives, and documents from the 60s and 70s, the artist composed a highly subjective, polyphonic history from the falsities of memory, the misperceptions of fact, and the missing film reels themselves. Exhibited as a solo project at Gasworks in London, a presentation that also incorporated archival documents like the Tricontinental film posters, alongside a screening program of found films. Forward to Guns for Banta was also exhibited at Manifesta 8 in Spain. Widely reviewed, the work established those frames by which his practice has since become known: militant movements of the 60s and 70s, processes of decolonization and the formation of identity, minor histories, and perhaps most crucially, the lost or absent document as the basis for a recuperative process of artistic research. The language to which he gravitates, a formalist reliance on fragments and forewords, placed in dialogue with the conjuring of orphans, ghosts, and shadows, further articulates the way in which his work imbues categories of academic inquiry with a highly personalized longing. As a dear friend, also an artist, once told me when describing her decision to explicitly incorporate another writer's work into her own installation, quote, "In a purely effective or charged way, I imagine that she was very angry at injustice in the world, and that the installation is sort of like these two proposals, mine, hers, facing each other. She did something with her anger and led people through a very specific kind of analysis. I respect and admire and value that channeling of anger. And even though your question of context remains open for me, I guess I wanted to be close to her somehow, which I understand is an imposing of my own desires. That this manner of appropriation, incorporation, reuse in artistic engagement somehow manifests an imposition of one's own desire seems in keeping with the ways in which Abonnenc grounds many of his projects, via dialogue, either actual or fictive, with 20th century figures. And it is in the spirit of this imagined community of artistic forerunners in which he seems to seek a harmony, or at least a means of cohabitation, that the topic of this conference most clearly asserts itself. Namely, how do the overtly politicized questions of identity intersect with conceptual strategies? How might we parse the relationship between the militant image, one designed to advance a singular ideologically determined meaning, with an idea that art is defined precisely by its ability to hold contradictory meanings and openness towards multiple interpretations? And are these two seeming polarities in the field of political and artistic discourse as divergent as we might think? As is written on the walls of a living room film set in Godard's La Chinoise, which addresses the pedagogical radicalization of students in the 60s, what relationship do vague ideas hold with clear images? And can this dialogue ever be non-confrontational? Abonnenc's work is deeply pertinent to this discussion, not just because he incorporates militant imagery alongside the recognizable strategies of conceptualism, but also because he seeks out such moments of confluence that unravel these alleged polarities. In the words of Portuguese protest musician Zeca Alfonso, he asks us to veja bem, alternatively translated as pay attention, look closely, activities to which the following discussion of two specific works will be directed. Played by non-professional actors who were actual members of the country's liberation army, the general plot of the fictional film from 1970, Guns for Banta, is described in the Manifesta catalog as follows, quote, Awa became an activist in her village, explaining the need to form a party not only to defend the farmers, but also to organize the resistance. One day, in her absence, Kurt, a Portuguese officer, arrives in the village. He gathers the population in the central square and searches the villagers' houses for pamphlets, photographs, symbols, flags, or any other sign demonstrating their sympathy for the announced rebellion. Nothing is found. In a fury, he executes a number of randomly picked men in cold blood. At that moment, Awa returns to the village, carrying her niece on her back. She doesn't flee, but she advances towards Kurt, thinking she might stop the massacre. Instead, he takes his weapon and shoots, killing her and her niece. Her death, more than her former words and images, appeals and emboldens the village to react, beginning the revolution. This narrative structure thus hinges not only on the importance of the militant image, those rumored photographs and pamphlets, but also on the absence of such images as a spark for contextual action. At the beginning of the independence movement, 99% of the local population in Guinea-Bissau was illiterate. In such an environment, the need for symbolic markers as pedagogical tools seems apparent. How might the information concerning class oppression and the need for revolution be disseminated? But what is interesting about Maldoror's film is that she attributes such ultimately reductive thinking, namely that an illiterate population is only able to learn via graphic imagery and overt symbolism, to the Portuguese colonizers. It is Kurt and his soldier thugs who initiate the search for material objects, and in so doing attribute an outsized value to such pedagogical mechanisms. In contrast, the villagers are stimulated to act not by words or images, but by a series of relational actions that lay bare the uneven operations and abuses of power. The absence that is most frequently discussed in Abonnenc's multiple-year project with Maldoror, the missing film reels themselves, thus points to a prior absence in the fictive world of the film, the unfound and likely never existent revolutionary images rumored to be in the villager's home. His work does not apply a conceptual gloss to the graphic propaganda aesthetics sourced in archival photography. Rather, by pointing out and thereby redoubling the manifold absences situated within and throughout the source material, he somehow finds a conceptual strategy embedded within the 1960s militant image. And this, I'm using the idea of conceptualism here advanced by Chemnitzer, the absence of the work, the lack of a tangible aestheticized object, as what catalyzes the effective response to generate active resistance and social change, and the idea that this absence is always situated in a particular context and as a response to one's immediate cultural and political environment. In 2012, Abonnenc premiered another multi-part body of work based on the lost, or more accurately, temporarily forgotten, legacy of an artist, the musician Julius Eastman. Curated by Oakley and Weser at the Palais de Tokyo as part of Intense Proximity, this 4-part piano installation, series of concerts and open rehearsals, highlighted 3 of what are arguably Eastman's most iconic compositions, and the work was restaged the following year at Kunsthal Basel. Born in 1940, Eastman studied first piano and then composition at Philadelphia's Curtis Institute before joining the Creative Associates program at the State University in Buffalo. While in residence at this locus for avant-garde music, he began to develop conceptual compositions in the style of John Cage. He soon acquired a reputation for provocation, unintentionally offending the composer of silence himself by incorporating a male striptease into a performance of songbooks, a move that Cage incorrectly interpreted as a mockery of his own sexuality. Relocating to Manhattan by 1970, Eastman performed both in the figurative uptown with classic ensembles like the Brooklyn Philharmonic, and also downtown with artists like Meredith Monk and Arthur Russell. After achieving a relatively brief period of professional success in the late 70s, early 80s, his final decade was marked by increasingly desperate circumstances. Evicted from his apartment in the East Village and depending on homeless shelters and the generosity of friends, circumstances through which he lost all of his recordings, archives, scores, Eastman died in 1990 at the age of 49. In 1998, Eastman's friend and fellow composer Mary Jane Leake began the process of rescuing this body of work from obscurity. Much like Abonnenc's archival research into Malderer, her recuperation relied on personal networks, seeking audio tapes, written scores, interviews, and photographs scattered across private file cabinets, basements, and institutional repositories. 7 years after these initial inquiries, she had finally gathered enough original recordings to release a 3-disc box set titled Julius Eastman, Unjust Malaise. And this was in 2005. Coinciding with the growing veneration of composers like Steve Reich or Philip Glass, Unjust Malaise forced this ever-narrowing minimalist canon to reckon with his music's use of uncontrolled, delirious romanticism, anarchic dissolution, and a hint of disco. In addition, Eastman's often dramatized display of his subject position as an African American and a gay man similarly forced this often homogenized field to pay attention to its relationship with the forceful charge of identity politics, not to mention the central role that jazz, and in particular John Coltrane, played in the early development of minimalist music. In his spoken introduction to a Northwestern concert in 1980, Eastman describes his thinking behind the use of sexualized and profoundly racist epithets for titles, which he only did in a period of 3 years. All the other works were titled Sonatas, Study for Piano, etc.
These names, let me put a little sub-system here. These names, either I glorify them or they glorify me. And in the case of gorilla, that glorifies gay. That's to say, there aren't many gay gorillas. I don't feel that gaydom does have that strength. So therefore, I use that word in the hopes that they will. You see, I feel that this point, I don't feel that gay gorillas can really match with Afghani gorillas or PLO gorillas. I don't. But let us hope in the future they might. You see, that's why I use that word gorilla. It means a gorilla is someone who is, in any case, sacrificing his life for a point of view. And you know, if there is a cause, and if it is a great cause, those who belong to that cause will sacrifice their blood, because without blood there is no cause. So therefore, that is the reason that I use gay gorilla, in hopes that I might be one, if called upon to be one.
The concert that followed this antagonistic opening figures large in Abonnenc's own work. To begin, out of a known corpus of over 50 compositions, the performances at Palais de Tokyo as well as in Basel present the same 3 songs that were performed at Northwestern. Eastman scored each of these works so that multiple instruments of the same kind could play them, a compositional strategy drawing on conceptualism in its de-emphasis of the significance of any particular object. 6 cellos, 10 violins, 2 pianos, anything would work. Yet despite this openness of interpretation, Abonnenc chose to present the 3 pieces as an arrangement for 4 pianos, exactly like in 1980. The one difference is that the pianos are arranged as a cross rather than in a row, a concession to the spatial requirements of a gallery versus concert proscenium. Abonnenc's artistic gesture here thus rests not in archival research or in an adaptive reuse of the found material, but in straight representation. The strategy becomes wholly about contextualization, a drawing of attention to the ideological and former precursors by shifting the frame of an existing work. The strength of this homage lies in 2 simple acts of transposition: the music concert to the gallery and African-American composers' music to the spaces of European art institutions. Contextualization similarly drove Eastman's prior decision to foreground these particular epithets as a title, the same type of redoubling in Abonnenc's practice we saw with Banta's multiple absences. He forces a confrontation with the ugliness of language. Either I glorify these words or they glorify me, by wrapping such language around a high culture artwork intended for the concert hall or the avant-garde art space, overly intellectualized. As Eastman said in the Northwestern talk we listened to earlier, he chose this particular epithet because it embodies, and the racist one for him, quote, a basicness, a fundamentalness, and eschews that thing which is superficial, or what can we say, elegant, end quote. In this text, he recasts elegance as a superficial guise used to mask a whole manner of sexist, racist, and classist moves, and he forces that into the art space. In New York at the time of these works' composition, 1978 to 79, the use of this term in relation to abstract artworks, to which it bore no real relation, was hotly debated. In 79, at the downtown exhibition venue Artist Space, a little-known white artist called Donald Newman exhibited a series of abstract charcoal drawing photography triptychs he made between 76 and 79 that he similarly titled, and you have the documents from Artist Space. The show initiated widespread debates, protests, sit-ins, and open letters, all circulating the conflict between a so-called progressive belief in artistic freedom that implicitly permitted racist discourse on one hand, and a group of primarily Black artists and curators who saw the work and the titling of it both as overtly offensive and an example of the art world's endemic racism despite its pretense to progressiveness. Exactly coinciding with this debate, and a marked shift from his more conventional titling, Eastman's use of the same term both recalls the conversation and turns it on its head. In his hands, the word is considered an intentional, a conceptual gesture of context-driven reproach. In bringing Eastman's compositions to the manifestly intellectualized art spaces of Europe, Palais de Tokyo, Kunsthal Basel, Abonnenc shifts this debate from the 1970s to the present and from the United States to Germany and France. Such histories are directly relevant to a social context engaged in the debate between liberal progressivism on the one hand and the idea that some works or some images should be off limits to some people on the other. And I'm thinking of cultural misappropriation or Charlie Hebdo in France. In the last few minutes, I'd like to play an excerpt from one of Eastman's compositions. Were we to see it performed live, in the closing phrases, additional pianists would emerge from the audience to join the original performers, collapsing the divide between performer and audience, while simultaneously denying the conventionally minimalist triumph of simplicity, concluding the work in a spaced-out atonality of clangorous overtones. For 55 minutes. I wish we could listen to it all, but there's no natural pause. It just becomes more and more anarchic. So, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So now we are going to listen to Arndt. Theorist and writer Lotte Arndt, which is based in France at Saint-Denis, lectures at the École Supérieure d'Art et Design at Valence, and accompanies, I really like this word, accompanies the work of artists who interrogates the post-colonial presence of the blind spots of modernity. Her PhD is dedicated to post-colonial negotiations in Paris-based cultural magazines related to Africa. She works closely with the French artist and writers group Ruse et l'Image. And she's a member of the research group called Global Art Prospective at the National Institute of History of Art, INHA, in Paris. And she publishes on artistic strategies that aim to subvert Eurocentric narratives and institutions. And she co-organizes cultural programs, screenings, and discussions in artistic and academic spaces. In 2017, she co-curated Candice Lee, A Hard White Body, with Lucas Brun at Béton Salon, a nice art center in Paris, Béton Salon. And she was a guest editor of the online magazine Calcala. in winter 2016, she was Goethe Fellow at Villa Vassiliev, another art center in Paris. The last major publications include Les Revues font la culture, Négociations postcoloniales, it's in French, Négociations postcoloniales dans les périodiques parisiens relatifs à l'Afrique, Crawling Double, Colonial Collecting and Affect, that she did with, edited with Mathieu Abonnenc and Catalina Lozano, and Hunting and Collecting Semi-Biology, so that's a book about semi-biologist practice. That was published in 2016. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me here, for organizing this fabulous conference. I'm so glad to have heard you over the last 2 days. I've learned so much. I'm so impressed of all the things that have been come together over the last 2 days. And I find it quite difficult to be the last one to talk. So please don't have the expectation that this brings together whatever it won't. It won't speak from a very tiny little small piece of the approach to the world that will be mine. Sophie already said that I collaborated various times with Mathieu, and in a certain manner you will feel that in my presentation. And so I had the hardest time since long to write that piece because I never knew what I had already written and already said. So maybe if it's if there are a lot of holes, a lot of jumps, a lot of please ask questions in comments. And I think we have the big advantage that we all saw the film yesterday. We heard Sandra speak about the same 2 works that I will speak about. So we have a kind of common ground that we can share. And so the idea, rather than to give my lecture, my reading of the work, would be to give some insights to it, and then to share the discussion with you, and to bring together our ideas. So my contribution will try to approach Mathieu's work from the perspective of his strategies to address the implication of the art field in violent and symbolic appropriations and erasures in imperial, colonial, racist and capitalist contexts that are rendered invisible. Mathieu's work inquires about the possibilities to take these erasures into account in order to address them critically. And this is a point where I have a short paragraph on Mathieu and on his the fact that he comes from French Guiana, that he lives in Paris, that actually he's a white artist within the framing of the BAM conference. And I was asking me a lot over the last 2 days if I would say that or I won't. And so right now I am saying it because I consider that in fact for all these questions of appropriation that we will discuss right now, it is important to know from where somebody speaks. And this does not mean, I think that the talk that I will give could have omitted that information, but that it's quite important in the frame of also the 4 speakers that we are, 4 or 3 white girls, that it's important speaking about a Paris-based artist who mainly speaks about African liberation movements, that it is an important information to take into account in his approach. While huge parts of Mathieu's work, this is difficult, yeah. While huge parts of Mathieu's work deal conceptually with representation strategies that inscribe dissident, minority, or misread practices in the art field, and Jennifer just talked about it, like the works of the Caribbean filmmaker Sarah Mother-Rohr, the work on Adrian Piper, works on Aaron Douglas, works on Julius Eastman and Frantz Fanon, to name but a few. The works that I'm concerned with today focus on the opposite, on the economy and material procedures to whitewash forms and materials, to strip them of their histories, to isolate and to decontextualize. The body of work that we will discuss today is therefore turning the gaze to focus on imperial violence rather than resistance, on the expropriations conducted in the frame of colonialism and global capitalism, and on the complicity in the art field and art history. I will argue that the two works are situated in a highly uncomfortable in-betweenness. They take their motivation in the search for militant third worldist aesthetics, as we have just seen also in the presentation of Jennifer, such as it has been theorized by Fernando Solanas and Octavio Getino in their 1969 Atherum Tercer Cine, a seminal text published in the OSPAL journal Tricontinental and very influential in leftist filmmaking in the 1970s. The manifest rejects Hollywood cinema as much as individual art house films. It proposes a militant aesthetics that relies on its own distribution, production, and active reception circuits, overcoming the separation between passive consumer, spectator, and producer. Referring to the text in the 2010 years includes also to inquire about how to inherit from the liberation struggles and progressive movements of the 1960s today without sanctifying or fetishizing them. This is the one hand. At the other hand, the two works confront stereotypical Afro-pessimist and colonial revisionist discourses from the 1960s till today, as one can find them condensed by Africa Adieu. And I've not shown any of my images. By Africa Adieu. And the art field's powerful capacity to appropriate and decontextualize artifacts and to integrate them in new narratives without acknowledging their provenance or modes of acquisition. I think here on theft or exchange in unequal power relations that was a basis for the semantic shifts that have been operated on African cultural artifacts and their successive classification as ethnographic or aesthetic signifiers. Abonnenc's works opts to locate its enunciation position at a crossroads that allows to circularly inhabit a position of critique that is impossible to defend as pure or ethical. As such, it is a powerful circular level. But it also encounters its limits as a purely conceptual gesture capable to signify in the very same field that it self-reflectively criticizes. Let me explain myself. I will take my point of departure in the description of an Italian film and Sans titre des corps entassés, and progressively introduce their hors-champ, the large field of references and research that accompany the work, extended through documents and loaded. It is precisely this constant production of what is at display at the one hand and what is only alluded to at the other, but remains disconnected, outside, and part of the work. This outside activates a spectator and calls for critical interrogation. The work refers ceaselessly to an outer frame that it refuses to reproduce, but evokes through a series of changing signs and indicators that are arranged by the artist according to the specific context of its exhibition. Among the constitutive disconnections is the relation of the two parts of the work themselves and the relation to their titles. The film and the minimalist copper sculptures are to be shown separately. So one of the instructions in the way how the work has to be displayed is not to show them together. And they may even be shown independently. The sculptures point to their absent reference only through their title and their hates. Is this a word? They have the hates of a standing human body. The film that we've seen yesterday shows in calm, carefully shot images the cutting, melting, and reshaping of half a dozen of copper crosses from the Katanga region in Congo. Here, bodies of white British craftsmen are at work, executing their gestures with professional precision. The focus lies on the working process, on the destruction, and then the material transformation of objects with a specific shape and a specific history into a new form that renders this history unrecognizable. I want here to refer to Karl Marx's conceptualization of the reduction of materially specific objects with histories and use values in the abstract form of value in capitalist exchange economies. As a commodity, they are losing their material characteristics, but they're still tied to specific bodies. The ideological form that this relation brings about and its complicity in genocide has been retraced by writers from Adorno and Horkheimer to Jean and John Komarov in their seminal text, Occult Economies and the Violence of Abstraction. In the film, two children voices with no clear gender status, carrying the accent from the formerly industrial region of Leeds, speak in voice-over a text that seems to have nothing to do with the working process on the screen. The accent underlines a geographical inscription, a cultural specificity, while the heavy, often nightmarish narration exceed by far what children's conception would be expected to comprise. Occasionally, image and text resonate. For example, when the voice speaks about the soldiers in the Congolese War and tattooing their names on their skin in order to be recognizable when they're killed, to have at least a name. Here, the geographical separateness of industrial work in Great Britain and raw material exploitation in the Congo is bridged for a moment. The image shows the tattoos on the bodies of the British industrial workers and links thus the post-industrial region of Leeds to the murderous Congolese War that caused up to 10 million of dead people over the past decades that are rarely mentioned in the newspapers. The destructive effects of raw material extraction, its links to the global economy and its colonial foundations are appearing in what can be read as a speculative evocation of transnational subaltern solidarity, at least as a wish. The sequence also condensates time and links the capitalist present to the colonial past, showing the resonances of the historical forms of imperial control over the region that has frequently been described as a geological scandal with today's murderous war. Let me come to the title, an Italian film, Africa Adieu, First Part Copper, a title that alludes to the outer frame that I was talking about, that the work is responding to without ever rendering it visible. The title refers directly to a homonymous film by the fascist Italian filmmakers Galtiero Jacopetti and Franco Prosperi, film from 1966 that proposes a revisionist white supremacist discourse on the African continent in the immediate post-independence years. The apartheid society in South Africa is pictured as the only positive proposition, while the film shows mostly slaughtered animals, images of wars and execution scenes. One of these scenes brought the directors to trial for complicity in murder, as it has been demonstrated that the execution commando waited before the deadly shot until the camera had adjusted its position. So the filmmaker staged a real execution in a certain manner. Africa Adieu is mentioned in Solanas and Getino's Assier and Terza as an infamous example of fascist image production. It has also been a major moment in the constitution of German internationalism, as a protest against the screening of the film mobilized African, Jewish and white German students in a transversal, intersectional solidarity movement that crossed the experience from National Socialism with anti-racist and anti-colonial motivations. Neither the film nor the sculptures show piled up bodies, which is actually the subtitle of the sculptures. Abonnenc speaks back to the representation of colonial violence and the prolongation of its impact by systematically refusing to display murdered, tortured, or suffering people. Rather, he transposes the destruction to the objects. While artifacts take here the place of human bodies, the transposition also refers directly to the successive expropriations in the history of art, be it in the frame of primitivism, through the incorporation of African objects in the renewal of European formal languages in the 20th century, or be it in the absence of the tracings of the provenance, history, and working processes in the use of metals from colonial origin in abstract art, notable minimalism. Pointing out these asymmetrical, non-consensual appropriation processes, Abonnenc's own artistic position is not remaining outside of the chain of expropriations and transformations, as he acquires the crosses and commands the smelting. Let me come to the voiceover of the film that introduces a second level of narration, and that operates once again through disconnections and echoing. It is written by the artist on the basis of mainly three texts: the Belgian imagination of pre-colonial copper extraction in the history of mining from the 1950s, as one finds it in the voluminous publication of the Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, predecessor of today's huge, formerly state-owned mining company that concentrates the subsoil exploitation in the Congo until today. The second is a text by the French ethnopsychiatrist Olivier Douville on child soldiers and their persecution as sorcerers, and here I come back to the Komarov text that I mentioned earlier. And finally, Sven Lindquist's Exterminer toutes ces brutes, Exterminate All These Brutes, a speculative study on the origins of genocide that borrows its title from Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. In parallel to Hannah Arendt's tracing back of the origins of totalitarian, I don't like that word, it never comes out of my mouth. You know what I'm speaking about? In the imperial conquest and colonial policies, the total erasure of cultural otherness in addition to economic squeezing and maximal exploitation is here described as a route for extermination. The images of the film do not show any of these references. The focus on the physical destruction of the cultural artifact that is closely tied to a pre-colonial economy and identity, they focus on the physical destruction of these Katanga crosses. The crosses are made of pure copper and have been objects of the voracious hunger for precious metals that the Belgian king Leopold II conducted in the Congo while the Free State was his private property. Huge numbers of them have been melted and transformed into blocks during Belgian colonialism, rendering that their cultural history invisible. Others are today to be seen in European museums, such as the Musée des Quai Branly that I chose because I'm living in that city, where they're accompanied by the mention Luba culture, currency 19th century, and become thus an ethnic marker of a categorized cultural group. After the Congolese independence, the crosses became a symbol on the currency edited by the Congolese state, and its importance as a nationalist marker of cultural identity has thus been reaffirmed. An Italian film enacts the destruction of these highly significant objects that Abonnenc has purchased on eBay, as Sandra already told us. The artist participates thus in the commercialized chains of appropriation and of erasure. The economic power to buy habilitates him to destroy and to reshape without even restituting the process. While object-based ontologies would stress the capacity of these objects, even in their new shape, to testify of their history, I would argue here that it is precisely the play with their appearance as minimal abstract sculptures that puts history at work. It is only when the materiality is articulated with specific contexts, including the white cube, and related to documents and narratives that allow to trouble the formalist appearance, that a work interrogates its status as a purely aesthetic signifier. For this reason, I want to talk briefly about two exhibitions. One at Leeds in Pavilion in 2012, and the other at La Fondation Ricard, Paris in 2012 also. Leeds actually co-produced the work. This was the first situation where it was shown. In Paris, here you have a view from the situation, only the copper ingots were shown in the exhibition space. Spectators were confronted to a seemingly purely formal work. Meanwhile, in the nearby former cinema, Abonnenc showed 3 documentary films by the Eastern German filmmakers Gerhard Scheumann and Walter Heinowski, who had been for decades in charge to point out and analyze the imperialist practices in the Third World by the RDR government. The films focus on the figure of Kongo Müller, the former commander of the National Socialist Wehrmacht and later mercenary in the secessionist part of the Congo under the leadership of Moïse Tshombe, after the murder of Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba and the brutal end of his progressist government in the Congo. The exhibition of the isolated copper sculptures fully calculates with the absence of this information in the white cube context, where numerous spectators that are familiar with Abonnenc's work were highly irritated about the seemingly formalist sculptures. A physical displacement to a location that does not belong to an identified exhibition space is here imposed as necessary in order to link the sculptures to the history of Western imperialism in the post-independence Congo. As an indication allowing to make the link, Abonnenc published a double page in the catalogue referring to Heinowski and Scheumann's book Kannibalen. He adds to the anthropophagous impetus of the RDR filmmakers that accuse Western mercenaries of cannibalism without any transgressive dimension, because we had this parallel to reference to Osvaldo de Andrade yesterday, and symbolically cuts off their heads in the photographs. Here are pictures from the film. At Pavilion in Leeds, UK, that co-produced the work, both parts have been displayed in a very different situation in the space of a former foundry. The ingots were here surrounded by the portraits of the representatives. I go a bit rapid, this is the situation. Portraits of the representatives of the enterprise and shown in the context of the disindustrialized region in which cultural institutions step in the space left empty in the formerly industrial architecture. Here, the economy of the art field is directly addressed. The 19th century portraits in stone overlook calmly the scene from which the references to the colonial context have totally disappeared. To conclude, I would like to come back to the tension that the work inhabits. Both self-reflectively interrogate the erasures that the modernist and colonial appropriations have brought about far beyond the field of art. Abonnenc's sly operation is to inhabit a guilty position of enunciation by repeating the destructive gesture that he criticizes, and thus rendering the art institutions that acquire or show the work complicit in the operation. Nevertheless, this critical gesture remains circularly tied to a practice that does not itself transcend the art field, with the role of the author in the specific configuration of signifiers. In how far can we consider that the work can enact its critical impact precisely because it is assimilated as a conceptual practice, and that this characteristic reduces simultaneously its transgressive potential? By remaining in the realm of the author who signs in the frame of an exhibition, both works are far from the claim for collective militant cinema with audiences that do not have access to art institutions and produced in activist economies that Gettino and Solanas claimed for. An Italian film and Sans Titre can deploy their critical strengths precisely there where they are participating in a chain of problematic economical and symbolic transactions that they render visible, but that they cannot themselves escape. Thank you.
you very much for the three really interesting and complex papers, because it highlights how much Mathieu Abonnenc's gestures are precise. So thank you for this. I would like to start with the fact that looking at the, well, first of all, we are going to discuss a bit together, and then I will open up quite quickly the discussion to the floor, because as we have seen the film all together yesterday evening, it would be really nice to have your perspective on the film as well. So, I was struck that yesterday evening, looking at the film, it was very apparent that it was about materiality and also the visual. And in all your discussion this afternoon, there was this history of the film industry embedded in the work in many ways. So it was a film studies criticality, almost, being used on an artistic gesture to address the minimal art. So I wanted to open the questions to you. Who would like to start?
About industrial question mainly, or?
Well, do you think that the Mathieu Abonnenc's gestures come from the film studies and act on the minimal arts?
I think it's both. I think that's where Mathieu Abonnenc is really interesting. It's about reversibility of the things and the capacity of this destruction. We're talking about destruction, and I think it's a very interesting point, because for me it's not a mere destruction. Of course, it is destroying these crosses, so which is a big problem, but they are already they disappear before. We say that he bought it on internet. That means we can't find them anywhere. I mean, physically they exist, but where? We don't see that. So by this gesture of destruction, he make appear and create a new cycle of life, according to me, for this thing who were not apparent, who disappear from the visible. So it is exactly the same with his reflection on movie or cinema, or why making more visible Africa Adio, which is, like you said, a fascist movie, and to make it appear in order to affect the way, and maybe in order to create a reflection on what we see and what we didn't see. I think for my part, it's what I don't know if it's.
I think your use of the phrase film studies is key here, at least in the case of Forward to Guns for Banta, precisely because you see this almost dry archival process rather than an allegiance to the ways in which those films lived and were circulated and shown initially. The question of audience and what audience are we talking to or about came up earlier, and the tricontinental movement and the tricontinental cinema to which he's referring always situated the screening of these films within communities, not in kind of a traditional black box, or, God forbid, a traditional white box. And that transposition shows an interest not necessarily in what made those films really manifestly important in the time in which they were made, and more an interest in the institutional and academic structures surrounding their traces as they currently exist. And I think that is an interesting shift.
I also would like to come back to what you said, Lotte, earlier about the fact that Mathieu was inhabiting a guilty position, which I found really interesting. And I would like to know what you think about it. I mean, is that his gesture as an artist to inhabit a guilty position? Isn't it the conceptualism principle as such? I mean, principle, because you were quite contesting the fact that conceptualism could be seen as critical. So can we reverse it and see it in the other way? Is that conceptualism the way you choose to produce the work?
Yeah, of course it is, but I mean this discussion I would like to have it with you all, because for me it's a crucial point. We screened this film together, Mathieu and I, about 2 months ago in Cologne, and we had this whole big political discussion, 2 hours, blah, blah, blah. And in the end, there's somebody who said, yeah, okay, so stop to tell me about that. In the end, it's a conceptual gesture, and we'll go to the museum. And then it stops. And then it's fine. And, you know, and there is something, by being conceptual, doesn't it also render its own militant gesture totally acceptable for the institution? This was my question.
I think that's exactly the issue, and also what makes the work interesting, in a way. And what you were mentioning earlier as well, why I find his work compelling is because I'm not 100% convinced by it, and so thinking through that process of why, and what are the distinctions between, say, intersectionality and homage and appropriation, particularly in this context, and how does an artist navigate that vis-a-vis the institution in which they're so deeply embedded? You know, he does make work for and with institutions, not outside of that, not through alternative distribution channels, and which again goes back to that question of using the militant film, but without the usefulness to which militant film has been placed. And it's precisely that tension that I think makes the work interesting, but also maybe problematic. And that boundary line I find interesting to think through.
In my opinion, guiltiness is not exactly the word I will use, for example, because I don't know exactly what it can be, you know, to be guilty. Well, okay, Mathieu is destroying the courses, for example, but he's simply showing the way factories still works. I mean, it's just putting in this chain of transformation something with no more value, and in order to make appear it can have value or add value or very symbolic or very important value. And so I think the whole process is problematic, but not just a gesture to put this kind of copper in the whole industrial process. Because in case we are all guilty, of course there is copper in the micro, in our laptops, so everywhere. So we're just using that or be, you know, involved personally in a capitalistic way of life, make us less guilty, just to make work with that. That's just my opinion.
And I think that's another way you can ask, does the fact that you're pointing to a problematic process or a problematic gesture or a problematic history exclude or somehow justify the replication of those same processes? And it's an open question to me.
But we, on screen, we not only see absent, we also see the bodies of the workers, and I think that's a very interesting point about what we are seeing. Because I try to talk about this kind of intersectional body, you know, and I think that exactly what we are seeing in this movie, that means a generation and generation of body doesn't matter, in fact, if they are black or white or slave or what, but who are physically involved with the domination relationship, and that they have as a professional or as a people to do as a social function. And what seems interesting to me is that we can see the reversibility again, you know, of this body which works how to say in a kind of you know, as a factory, you know, is just a chain, also a chain of body from generation, from country. That's it. So So I think that's also why we are really guilty, for example. When we I was trying also to talk about the fear we can personally feel of being disclassified, you know. And I think what we see there is just white people also trying to not declassify, you know, and just they can exert a very violent gesture on other body, symbolically, because it's always better to not at the very low part of the scale, you know. So I think we are the guiltiness is very complicated. That's where I think it's interesting also. What is guilty, how we share the responsibility of this whole process.
Okay, I think we can now open up the discussion to the floor. So, who would like to start? I see 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay. Hi. What struck me when the images of the Basel installation were shown was that in the same city are, of course, other copper staffs, round ones, leaning up against the wall precisely like that. And they are part of Joseph Beuys's installation, Hearth. And, of course, that brings it to another little twist in the sort of relationship between guilt or not. I mean, the Italian mentioning in the title, I just thought maybe some references to fascism and whatever. So Beuys is somebody who had a fascist past and then started making social sculpture and all of those kinds of things. It's going round and around somehow. Thank you for complicating that for me.
Yeah, thank you so much for that series of complex papers. I do think that the debate is superb, actually, in terms of thinking about this question of guilt, because I think what it does is it returns the problem of ethics to a space in which often we think ethics can be evacuated within minimalist discourse. So returning us back to the ethics is really quite important, I think. I think Lotte, I enjoyed your paper so much because what it did was it brought forward an ethical challenge in terms of us having to balance two ethical wrongs and the ways in which within those two ethical wrongs there are different complicities. And what I mean by that is if we think about the image of the Katanga crosses in the Musée de Quai Branly, and I think we'd all understand the problematics of the display of the work there as a set of ethical wrongs, despite the fact that the crosses are intact, that the details of their provenance are probably there, there's a clarity in terms of the detail of materiality and the names of the people, etc. And yet we still see there's an ethical wrong. We then go to the Abonnenc scenario in Macvaro, in the Leeds Pavilion, where the complete inverse happens. Everything is evacuated. There's no detail of the people, there's no detail around the things. We're there to pure materiality, and yet we see, you point us towards an ethical wrong. So, okay, we've got two ethical wrongs here. So here we call for the wisdom of Solomon. And I think in that, the work that we are asked to do is really important. You point us towards minimalism, not as something we can drift by, an excuse not to look, but actually the reason to look even harder and to look for what is not there. And I think you pointed that out in your talk. So my point is to you, it's not really a question, it's kind of just something being thrown into the debate, which is, does this work of evacuation, the kind of the disappearance strategy to take things out and thereby solicit deeper looking, does it really work? I mean, I know in Jochen Goetz, I mean, people will know the work of Jochen Goetz, The Disappearing Monument, where that particular work, Jochen and Esther Schalaf Goetz, talk about using the disappearance of the monument to solicit, to invite memory. So evacuation draws things in. And by filling the thing, by presenting all the detail, you push the viewer out. You allow the viewer to walk past the Katanka and the Kita Bromley, because all the information is there. It's all there, where it came from, how it got here, blah, blah, blah. That's what people are saying happens, and I think that's what you're setting out in your paper, that the hors comp actually produces a much more complex spectatorship. That's the possibility, but I'm never sure whether that actually does work. Do you think it works? Do you think that emptying out works in your viewing, in your looking at the work?
Yeah, maybe, I mean, most of us who are speaking here have had these previous gatherings around the work, somewhere in an exhibition, somewhere in the world where one of the four artists we were discussing has been shown. And we had this terribly interesting moment at McVal together with the conservative, with the person who's in charge of the conservation. Personally, I do not work in a museum. I'm very rarely in the situation to be. I'm coming from the conceptual side. I'm coming from post-colonial critique. So the first questions I would have at work would come from the place where I'm speaking right now. We spent, I think, 1.5 hours in front of the ingots, speaking about if they had moved for 1 millimeter there, if the color would precisely be the same as 200 years ago, and how one would, you know. And so then we had this discussion, and at the end of the day, she was telling us that she was totally, she had never had heard actually about what the work was about. And this for me was quite telling, in like answering to your question. There is something, I mean, it's not the work as such that would claim for this history or for this complicated spectatorship. It would need a curatorial accompaniment, it would need a mediation, it would need something, a document that activates this view. And I mean, McVal was a perfect example for the contrary of that. It was displayed a bit, so the curators decided to show it in between two works that showed undressed black bodies. So the exact opposite of what Mathieu tries to work about.
I should maybe, before we listen to other questions, I should add something to that, because I was there as well. First, the bars were set in the space, opening up a huge space within which we could project ourselves, and we were wondering, is that a screen? Is that a space for ourselves? So it was not something that we couldn't rely on. It was a space we could project ourselves, and we started a long discussion about, okay, that's bar, so it's a reference to minimalist practice. We were speaking about André Cadere, for instance, but we were also seeing the reference of a film, so the lack of an image here, and also a space to project our bodies inside it. So I think the question of the place of the gifts is much more complex than that, and there is elements in the work that conveys that questions in many ways and complexify again this.
And the title is precisely Bodies in a Pile, or at McVal there are only 3 ropes. That means that the bodies in a pile are, in fact, the bodies of the viewers in a certain way in front of the work. So it's not just looking at pieces that look like minimal art, because in fact it doesn't look like, if you like closely. There is no virginality of the material, no purity, or it's just you see every marks of the it's a pretty bad production, I can say. I'm not a specialist of the, but it's not. You don't look like at something that pretends to be a minimal sculpture, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, how you all are pointing out how this particular curation impedes the ability to read the work at all, or at least in the way the artist intended, precisely because that was an issue that the original, like the canonical minimalists had. You know, that's why they ended up with places like Dia and Shinadi, because of the idea that in traditional gallery spaces, particularly when juxtaposed with other artworks, the meaning they attributed or what they hoped viewers would get from the work was totally lost. And so you have this recursive problem of the minimalist object.
Yeah, and something else that on Adler Fasselier, which is the name of the head of the conservative department at McVal, said to us, it was the bars, which are made in copper, are not stable. I mean, this is a really unstable material, and in order to prevent anything to happen to the bars, they put a slice, wax. Yes, this material called wax on it, to be sure that the copper will remain stable. But discussing with Mathieu Abonnenc afterwards, we realized that it was not absolutely not his wishes. He wants the copper to change, to remain unstable, or to remain a living material, which again changed a lot how we can understand these artworks in this exhibition space. Can we take another question? Sonia?
Hi, I actually had a very similar question that David raised around the space between guilt and complicity, but I also had a slightly different question, which follows on from what you've been talking about, which is to do with the law of the cinematic in relation to the ways of looking at objects, and I think that there are two different ways of experiencing, if that makes sense. So for me, there is a question mark and a gap for me in the looking between these two forms, I could say, where I became very troubled by the film in that for me I started to have a kind of very loving relation to these white male bodies that were working, and started to kind of question myself about my relationship to the narrative that was going on, how this started to make me feel quite complicit. Does that make sense when I say that? Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
If you want to answer, or
I don't know if I have an answer to that, but I really like this, like to feel this complicated complicity. The moment where you feel that you cannot not be, have a kind of positive relation to these bodies at work, and at the same time, this renders you, inscribes you in a process where you precisely see the problematics of what they're doing. So, I really like that that observation that is produced with a camera, that I'm always astonished by in its stability. So there is something that is so identified to the working body, that the fact that the image is so, in the end, staying outside, like observing from a situation that is not involved in the movement, but showing the movement, observing the movement, that is surprising in the effect that it produces. Does it make sense? Not really.
so maybe last questions, and then we start the plenary session. So there was one question here. Where is the mic?
Firstly, I'd like to thank each presenter and Sophie for a wonderful panel. I was wondering whether you could feed my curiosity in relation to the film concerning the voiceovers. Lotte touched upon, but voiceover or its problematics in a way. I was curious in relation to the choice of the voiceovers, the narrators. Incidentally, I happen to know one of them.
met one of them?
Yes, just coincidence. If I rightly remember, there were two narrators. They're not children, they're teenagers. Their voices were quite similar, and obviously not having enough knowledge in relation to where the text was coming from, whether it was scripted, for the film, or whether it was edited, which I happen to realize where it's coming from now. I'm quite puzzled in relation to the choice of the voices being too similar. So perhaps you can elaborate on that.
Maybe you can explain what is troubling for you in the fact that they're similar.
Purely based on aesthetics, I was wondering why the two, if the artist wanted to have two different kinds of voiceovers, why the voices were too similar. What was the philosophy behind having two similar voices, if there were two voices?
So
If that
they
makes
were
any
also
sense.
juvenile. They were very disconcertingly juvenile.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't know if I have an answer to that. So,
Just, I don't know if you talk about that, I can't remember now, but I know Mathieu was very influenced by a text called The Children Resort. I can't remember the name of the two researchers that wrote this paper about, I don't know if I can explain well, I'm going to try. So there were children in Ghana, I think, that were considered as wizards, and they were put into the situation that they were wearing the trauma of the history, because there have been so many deaths under the generation before that the children were put in really ambiguous situation, becoming the new generation and also a threat for the new generation. So
this is actually part of one of the three texts that I mentioned, the Olivier Douville text, where the author, ethnopsychiatrist, where he talks about this figure of the sorcerer and the persecution of street children that have been child soldiers in the context of the Congolese War. So this is part of the script. I just don't remember to have talked to Mathieu about that. This was his reason to have a teenage performance for the voices. Actually, I've never.
And incidentally, that's teenagers.
No, there's a boy and a girl.
But I'd also like to say that in English, the English accent is highly connotated, which you probably, and Mathieu probably can't even hear. I mean, I just thought it was very confusing.
No, this is not. So this is, I commented on that. This, I think, is really a decision to inscribe this film in a particular geographical context, which is Sheffield. So, and to talk about, I mean, just as a production process, to talk about a region that is itself taken in a heavy disindustrialized process. So it's over. Voila. And so this to have a clearly geographical anchorage in that, to evocate, to evoke this colonial history by showing a region that is totally clearly inscribed in the British context.
We have to end the conversation now. I'm really sorry. It was a fantastic afternoon. It's becoming late, and now it's time for the plenary closing and drinks and.